Hey everyone, welcome to the week. This is Professor Rios. Hope you're doing well. This week we move on to chapter 10 or week 10, which covers Central Asia. So this is the newest region in the world as defined by your book. It is a region that contains the different former Soviet states. In fact, every single place here used to be part of the Soviet Union, beginning with Afghanistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and the biggest, Kazakhstan. Anything with Stan means people of. So it's basically Afghan people, the Turks, Uzbeks, Tajiks, Kyrgyz, Kazakhs. So it's land of the Kazakhs, land of the Uzbeks, and so on. This region is very complicated yet simple in some ways. There are many ties to Russia, of course, because they belong together at one point. As you can see, it's on the far western portion of the Himalayan Peninsula, the whole Tibetan Plateau. It's remarkably close to China. It's inexorably tied to both of those countries, China and Russia. It is politically, culturally complex in some ways, and in other ways, much more streamlined. It is home to really dry conditions, with the exception of the mountains, because, of course, in the mountains, as you can see by the color, in places like Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, you have mountains. And so you have a little bit more rainfall and snowfall. This is sort of the far edge of the Himalayan mountains, the Karakoram range. So it's sort of in that realm. It's dry as a function of, look at the color, plenty of mountains, and of course mountains imply usually higher terrain with more vegetation and more snowfall and rainfall. However, this region is really defined by aridity. So we'll get into that. Here you find the Aral Sea, which is basically one of the world's most significant environmental disasters caused by humans, not climate change, but humans as a function of what happened there in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. We're still basically, or they're still paying for it in the early 2020s. Okay, so let's move on. Again, the connections, if you look at it on the more macro scale, you have Southwest Asia. Here you have Turkey and Russia on the north and northeast. You have India and Pakistan to the southeast. You have China, the Tibetan Plateau to the east. So it's in a very convoluted, complicated geography, which is both good and bad, depending on your point of view. All right, so that is the Google Earth sort of overview of the area. Let's look at the slides themselves. Here you see how this is in Uzbekistan, Tashkent. As you can see by the architecture, the really beautiful, intricate tile work on the buildings. This is very Muslim in its origin. When you look at these arches here, you see this in that big hotel in Dubai everywhere. So these are very distinctive arches that are found in areas, for example, the Middle East, and in other places where Islam is a dominant religion. So Islam is a dominant religion here, but you also find traces of other religions like Christianity, Buddhism. So it's sort of in the crossroads of many different places. These are the objectives, a few less than in some of the other regions. So a total of 7. And some of the key concepts and um, items and terms like exotic river, we'll get into that and so on. This Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is a sort of a geopolitical alliance between Russia, China, and several others. Salinization is a big deal there, as well as desertification. Less so deforestation, because it's already a pretty dry area to begin with. So desertification becomes sort of a bigger deal in the region. Okay. All right, so here's the idea of setting the boundary. So it's landlocked. In fact, it has one of the few places on Earth where you have doubly landlocked countries. Easy for me to say, right? Let me say that again. It is one of the few places on Earth where you will find a doubly landlocked country, and that would be Uzbekistan, meaning Uzbekistan is surrounded by countries that are themselves surrounded by countries. Again, 5 newly independent republics. It covers some of the autonomous regions of Western China, and I highly recommend you watch this video on what are China's autonomous regions, because China itself has a very complicated geography that we'll get into later in the term. There is the URL. It reemerged as a region, as I mentioned, when the Soviet Union broke up in 1991. So there is a unified history there, good, bad, or otherwise. This is what I call the Himalayan wheel. So the Himalayas is a physical feature. So the Himalayas are here. You have the Tibetan Plateau to the north. And this region formed when India, what we know today as India, collided with Eurasia, forming this very distinctive mountain chain. It is the only place on Earth where you find every single 8,000 meter peak and higher. But from the Himalayas, you have connections to every other Asia there is. Russia, Central Asia, East Asia, dominated by China, Southeast Asia, South Asia, dominated by India, and Southwest Asia, which ends in Iran. So there are definite connections. There are religious, political, cultural, and language connections throughout the region. It's impossible to get away from that. So we did Russia last week. We're moving on to Central Asia, and then we move on to East Asia, South Asia, and Southeast Asia. Okay. So these are the boundaries in the west and the east. The west is more arid. The east is it's higher in elevation with bigger and more imposing mountains, because you're now reaching the western edge of the Himalayan mountains. And so this is a look at it from the perspective of a map. Again, the different countries from Afghanistan to the south to Kazakhstan to the north. And then, of course, you have what we call Mongolia / the extreme western portion of China, Tibet, which many people consider to be independent and separate from China. Very controversial. Alrighty. You know, getting to the ISS before SpaceX used to have to happen out of a place called Baikonur Cosmodrome. When the US space shuttle ended in 2011, the US had no way to get the ISS, so we had to hitch a ride with the Russians. That cost a lot of money, and many thought of it as embarrassing, quite frankly. with SpaceX in the mix now, as of 2020, now we can do it from Florida again. But the Russians still use, it's called Baikonur Cosmodrome. It's their version of the Kennedy Space Center. Here is the extreme eastern portion of Central Asia, which is dominated by, Mongolia, and then extreme Western China and Tibet, which is one of those regions that's semi-autonomous, but still part of China. It's one of those weird, touchy subjects. People don't want to call it just Tibet because they don't want to mess up or piss off China. Yeah, super complicated. This gets into politics and political science, which is beyond the course, but there is a geographical component to it. So it's hard to get away from it. The physical landscape. So there you see an image from the Tibetan plateau, and while it looks really low, that elevation is about 15,000 feet. So the mountains are clearly much higher. The mountains can go from 18 to 28,000 feet in elevation. It's the highest range in the world. So that's the Central Highlands. The plains and basins either have large rivers or deserts. So it's a much drier climate. If you refer back to the Google Earth image, remember it looked more tan, like the color here. Okay. Again, the physical landscape, home to many large lakes, many of which are threatened as a function of climate change because the glaciers are evaporating away. So the source of water is also going away. There is uneven precipitation, irrigation, and there is an increase in salinization because if you live in a dry area and you lose water, what you often leave behind is salt residues. Okay. Here are some of the environmental issues. Again, it is a very dry place generally as an average. So the further west you go, the drier it is. And we'll talk about the Aral Sea coming up. It's really the biggest environmental disaster, not only of the region, but quite frankly, one of the world's biggest. The Gobi Desert is a desert in central China that affects eastern China. So many times there are days in Beijing, the capital of China, where dust from the Gobi Desert is a problem there. All right, so some other environmental issues: resource extraction, water, desertification, and to a lesser extent, deforestation. So here's the idea of salinization. Look at those soils. See how light in color they are? Very poor, very sandy, and filled with salt. The next big one is the Aral Sea. And the Aral Sea sits where you see the little red marker. It used to be the world's fourth largest lake, and it has shrunk by 90% of its original size. That's a big deal. And this is not a climate change issue at all. It has its genesis in agriculture back during the Soviet era. So the Aral Sea roughly translates to Sea of Islands. Many islands used to dot the surface area of the lake. It is called an endorheic or endorheic drainage basin, meaning it has no outlets. Everything drains into it, nothing drains out of it. And so it used to be home to a fishing industry and ports and communities that used to dot the shorelines of it. But as you will see, that has changed significantly. So again, it used to be the world's fourth largest. It is now 1/10, so it has shrunk by 90%. the Soviets diverted two rivers that used to recharge its waters. And by diverting those rivers rather, because the climate is already dry to begin with, it meant that the lake began to evaporate. And so this is the alteration of really an entire ecosystem. It is not a human, it is 100% human cause, but it is not climate change. So there are second and third order effects to what happened there. So in addition to collapsing the fishing industry, people lost jobs and livelihoods because there was so much fertilizer runoff. When the lake dried up, a lot of that dried up fertilizer and pesticides became like dust, which could then be picked up by the wind and carried away. And that has essentially the negative effect of respiratory disease. Similar things are happening in California in a place called the Salton Sea. In addition, another second and third order effect is that the winters are now colder and the summers are now warmer because you no longer have a large body of water to regulate your temperature. If you live near water, your winters tend to be less cold and your summers tend to be less hot. Now, if you lose that radiator, basically, then you get more extremes in temperature. So here's what it looked like in '89 on the far left. 2003. Here it looked healthy. Notice how it doesn't look healthy here. By 2009, this is what it looked like. And as of October 2018, notice how there seems to be a little bit more water than in 2009. This will seasonally refill and then dry up again. It's not very deep. There is an area to the north where they have built a dam, and it's hard to tell, but the dam is like right there. And they've been able to sort of maintain the northern smaller lake in pretty good shape. So that dam has had a positive effect. The salinity of that water has decreased and the volume has increased. But the southern end, that's pretty much going to at one point dry up entirely. The only reason this hasn't is because this here is deeper. This here is much shallower. And here's what it looks like now. Fleets of ships that are now ghost ships because there's no longer any reason for them to be there. Climate-wise, well, aridity would be the one term that I would use. Notice how everything is in this orange or yellow color, meaning dry climates. On the extreme edges, you find declimates as you get closer and closer to Russia. But it is clearly dominated by climates that are dry with extreme temperature ranges, as you see there by the red lines. Hot summers and relatively cold winters. Including some that are below zero, in fact. Mongolia, here in China, Kazakhstan. And then very close to this zero down here. Desertification and climate change. So it's already a fragile environment. This is something that you have to think of when you think of a desert. Deserts are already fragile environments. And by that I mean they get a limited amount of water. And if that water doesn't come, you rely on that. And if it doesn't come, it has significant repercussions down the line. So this places pressure on Russia and China and the EU to assist as a function of proximity. Here's the issue of climate change. So these glaciers that are basically shrinking away tend to provide lots of drinking water for the region. So if the glacier is gone for good at some point, guess what? The water supply of over 2 billion people is now affected. By this, I'm talking about China, India, and other places. Let's look at some of the people issues. So population, no big surprise, a large swath of the region scores in the fewer than 6 people per square kilometer. And even at its most dense, you're talking about between 100 and 500 people per square kilometer. That's it. It's a very small area where you tend to find that. Life expectancy and fertility. So fertility is still relatively high, anywhere between the high 2s and 4.8. Afghanistan, not surprisingly, is the least developed area of this entire region. Afghanistan is a puzzle. Afghanistan is an enigma. It has been, frankly, lawless for generations. It was probably lawless before your parents were even born. That's how in bad shape Afghanistan actually is. So in a region that is roughly in bad shape, Afghanistan kind of stands out. On the opposite end, Uzbekistan is probably the best. It's probably in the best shape of any of these countries. So let's look at some pyramids. So here's a population pyramid of Afghanistan. Still in stage 2, but even they have slowed down. This is the 2020 graph, 4.7. In 2010, the fertility rate was 6. And in 2000, it was 8. This is 8 kids per woman. It's up to almost 4.7, or down to, in 2020. So it's still growing fast, just not as fast. Here's Mongolia, and you could definitely see the breakup of the Soviet Union echo. This would be roughly 1990, and then boom, there you see the significant change. That breakup led to a lot of uncertainty, and when uncertainty happens, people have fewer kids. Here is Kazakhstan, same issue. Here's Uzbekistan, the same issue. Notice how they have slowed down and stabilized, which is different than any of these places. These slowed down and then began to pick up again. Uzbekistan is kind of the exception in this region. Again, in the highland regions, you still have what are called pastoralists. And transhumans, these are people that basically are nomadic in nature. They move around. And in the lowland regions or lower elevations, you generate, you depend on these rivers that are called exotic rivers. An exotic river is a river that is constantly flowing, even through a desert. Because the water comes from somewhere else. In the case of Central Asia, that somewhere else is the Himalayan mountains. That'll be the case for India, that'll be the case for China, that'll be the case for Southeast Asia as well. Some of the unique geographical features. So you have what's called the Tarim Basin, part of the Taklamakan Desert. This area is basically unpopulated, with the exception of the edges. where the water comes down from the mountains. So you find people along the edge, but in the middle, that's what it looks like. Literally thousands of square kilometers of nothing but yellow sand. That's it. Let's look at the idea of subsistence agriculture. So this is the kind of agriculture you practice in order to feed yourself and maybe the people near you. So here is an alluvial fan. So you're looking down on the earth. This is a mountain range. This is a river, a gully, a canyon. The water flows really, really fast through here. And then the canyon ends and it opens up. And then the water goes in all directions. And you create this very distinctive fan. So this is thinner here and it's progressively thicker as you go uphill. And what happens here is you have a lot of agriculture that can take place here because this is like a sponge and it collects a lot of water. Okay. Some of the migration flows, you saw this image before, but from the Russian perspective, there was a lot of migration out of this region into Russia, and some of it from Russia and from China into places like Western China, Tibet, and Mongolia. Some of it, though, is back to Russia. This is the idea of urbanization in Central Asia, still pretty low with very few exceptions. And like any region of the world, urbanization is on the increase. You know, in the United States, in Canada, in Europe, urbanization is already pretty high. But in many places around the world that are still developing, urbanization is increasing really, really fast. You know, in some of these places, we have, just like in the Caribbean or Latin America, you have this problem: urban primacy. Urban primacy, if you recall, is the issue of each country or a country having a population center that is dominant, meaning it's the most significant city in a place. And when that happens, the majority of people want to move there because that is where the majority of choices and possibilities are for economic improvement. Okay. We mentioned some of these. As far as language, so think of a place like Afghanistan, where you have a variety of, whether it be Indo-European, Altaic, or Dravidian kind of languages. So it's this very complicated patchwork of languages. Remember, the borders of Afghanistan were emplaced by the United Kingdom. So it's a superimposed border that doesn't really mean much to a lot of people that live within it. That's unfortunate. As far as religious diversity, we have quite a bit, mostly of, you know, you have Christianity, you have Islam, and you have Buddhism, to a smaller extent, Judaism. But Islam and Tibetan Buddhism are the two dominant religious drivers inside the region. I would say a bit more towards Buddhism as you head east, a bit more Islamic as you head west. The geopolitical framework is, of course, complicated and dominated by China, my bad. It's impossible to get away from the dominance of and the influence of China. Afghanistan, I mean, the United States basically has pulled out of Afghanistan, and if you've paid attention to the news, you know what a disaster that has been. So it's a very complicated, turbulent, volatile region, especially Afghanistan. Frankly, considered to be one of the least developed places on Earth. Contested space, well, where China, Afghanistan, Pakistan down here, Kyrgyzstan, where these countries all meet, you have very complicated borders, you have a very complicated terrain, and there's a lot of contested space. You've heard of Kashmir. We'll get more into that when we talk about South Asia. But, you know, you have China and Pakistan and Afghanistan and Tajikistan all sort of converging in one area, and it makes it, frankly, very complicated. Let's look at this, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Originally established by China, Russia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan. And as you can see, there's Putin. Can't get away from him. And here's Xi Jinping. This is the premier president of China. He's in the news quite a bit. So China and Russia are the two dominant members of this cooperation. This is sort of like that area of the world's version of NATO-ish to some extent. It's a multinational cooperation, but it has grown from 6 to 8. So it now includes Pakistan and India as of mid-2017. So it's an interesting alliance because it has 1, 2, 3, 4 states that, along with Russia, used to be part of the Soviet Union. It has China, one of the biggest economies in the world, eventually will be the top economy in the world. And then you have India and Pakistan, two countries that have been historical enemies, don't really like each other quite well, yet they're both members of this cooperation organization. So it's an interesting alliance that they have formed, and it's an issue of trying to combat Western influence on the region. And by Western, I mean United States and European influence over the region. So make of that what you will. Anyway, that's it for the lesson for the week. Again, it's a relatively new region as defined in the collection of regions. Connections to China, connections to Russia. It is inexorably tied to the Himalayas. So the geography plays a big role in just about every aspect of life in the region. If you have any questions, please come to the live office hour, ask by email, or get with me any way you can. Otherwise, I hope you have a great week, and I will talk to you soon. Bye.